When he was born, Gerald Ford was brought into a very different life he ended up living. Born Leslie Lynch King Jr. on July 14, 1913, his real father was a wool trader named Leslie Lynch King Sr., and he was so abusive of Ford's mother that he once hit her repeatedly on their honeymoon just for smiling at another man. Dorothy A. Gardner left Omaha, Nebraska when Ford was just 16 days old after being threatened at knife point by Leslie one night. She went to Grand Rapids, Michigan to live with her parents and met a much better man named Gerald M. Ford. He was renamed after his stepfather and gained his admirable character while growing up there in Grand Rapids. He once quoted the rules of the household to be, tell the truth, work hard, and be home for dinner. Growing up, Ford was heavily involved in the Boy Scouts and won several awards, and was also named an Eagle Scout. The Scouts were so involved in his life that he requested for over 400 Boy Scouts to attend his funeral. His other passions were education and sports, primarily football. He was a center and linebacker in high school and at the University of Michigan. He was even offered a position for the Detroit Tigers and the Green Bay Packers, but chose instead to attend Yale to study law. After graduating, he opened a law practice, but went to war right after opening it. When the war ended, he moved back to Grand Rapids to get married and shifted his focus towards Republican politics. He proved to have the character and knowledge to work his way up to the House of Representatives, and was chosen as the vice president for President Nixon. When Nixon resigned, Ford took the role of healing the troubled nation after the Vietnam War and the Watergate scandal.
30th President of the United States, he said, "Our long national nightmare is over." By saying those words, the new president hoped to move past the Watergate scandal and lead the country in the right direction. However, during his presidency, Ford faced many challenges and lots of controversy. The economy was dealing with both inflation and unemployment, along with fiscal problems. There are also controversies over social issues, including busing, abortion, and women's rights.
On September 8, 1974, President Ford granted Richard Nixon a full, free, and absolute pardon for all offenses Nixon committed or may have committed while president. Hoping to bring closure to the scandal, Ford instead faced many protests, one of which included his press secretary Gerald Terhorst resigning. In an attempt to answer his critics, Ford agreed to appear before the committee. In a nationally televised appearance on October 17, 1974, Ford denied having promised a pardon or having made any commitment at all regarding Nixon's resignation and stated there was no deal, period, under no circumstances. Many historians also believe that a deal did not happen between the two. However, some still think that a quid pro quo occurred, stating that Nixon would only resign if he was pardoned by Ford. On to the economy. Inflation and unemployment had a big impact on American society, and the rising price of oil only made the situation worse. Ford did admit that the economy was in recession due to the current problems, and it turned out to be the worst one in 40 years. In 1973, the consortium of oil exporting nations called OPEC embargoed its shipments of oil to the United States in protest of Nixon's administration's decision to support Israel in the Yom Kippur War. The embargo ended before Ford took office, but the price of foreign petrol remained high. The troublesome situation that America was now facing was given the name stagflation. To gain support, Ford asked Americans to wear buttons saying "Win" for Whip Inflation Now. After a few people decided to wear the buttons, the campaign was considered a large failure. Ford then enacted the tight money policy that included tax cuts and requests to Congress to cut government spending. Yet, President Ford also fought with Congress over the balance of tax cuts and government expenditures, vetoing over 50 pieces of legislation. Later, in his State of the Union address in 1975, he asked for a tariff on oil imports and taxes for domestic oil production. Although facing more struggles with Congress about his legislation, by 1976, the economy began to recover. Inflation dropped from 9.1 to 5.8%, and unemployment dropped from 9 to 7.4% in the time span of 1975 to 1976. Ford also faced troubles with the violence in Boston dealing with integrated busing to school, and the New York City bailout almost went bankrupt in 1975. Ford's response to the busing issue reflected his preference for a less active federal government, though state and local governments decide local issues. However, he contrasted those views when he gave $2.3 billion loan to New York to assist them. Overall, President Ford faced many domestic issues during his presidency, but did the best he could to combat them, and eventually started seeing some results.
Good afternoon. As we have learned from our other historians, President Gerald Ford was a very interesting man. He took presidency after the resignation of Nixon and was not praised by the public.
The public eye did not like that Ford was trying to push past the Watergate scandal, and felt that he was covering up for Nixon, and was going to be very similar in office. Today I will be discussing President Gerald Ford's foreign policy. Through the eyes of many historians, it appeared that Ford engulfed many previous policies of Nixon. For example, Ford pushed ahead in the negotiations with China and the Soviet Union, that Nixon began. In November, he met with Soviet Premier Leonid Brezhnev to plan the next round of the arms talks. The arms talks were begun to bring peace between the two nations and reduce the number of weapons each country holds. Later that year, Ford traveled to Helsinki, Finland, to discuss the future of East and West relations. 35 nations attended the discussion. During these discussions in Helsinki, Ford signed the Helsinki Accords, which created better cooperation between Eastern and Western Europe. Later, in 1975, the U.S. merchant ship Mayaguez was seized by the communist government in Cambodia, in the Gulf of Siam. To prove his power and defense over the citizens of the United States, Ford launched a huge military response. He sent 2 airstrikes and a crack team of U.S. Marines to rescue 39 crew members that were aboard the ship. His outrageous response cost the lives of 41 Americans. However, this did show his defense over his country. Throughout his presidency, he did not have many foreign accounts and policies, but for the few that he had, you could see that he was trying to repair and defend America and bring peace between Eastern and Western Europe.
Clearly, Gerald Ford was not liked at the time of his presidency by many. On September 22, 1975, Ford faced near death when Sarah Jane Moore fired a high-caliber revolver at him outside of his hotel in San Francisco. She later pled guilty and was sentenced to life in prison. After Ford's presidency, many took a different approach to looking at him, believing that pardoning Nixon was the best course of action that he could have taken at the time. Bill Clinton awarded Ford for this action in 1999. Ford entered office under unfortunate circumstances. Along with the Watergate scandal, the economy was failing, the Vietnam War was ending, and there were high tensions between the U.S. and the USSR. Ford also had a unique perspective on the government's role in society, saying, "A government big enough to give us everything we want is a government big enough to take from us everything we have." This clearly persuaded many of his actions in office because of his extensive use of the veto power. After his presidency, Ford went on to write many books and be involved in many corporate boards and commissions. For example, Ford was co-chair of the National Commission on Federal Election Reform in 2001. Ford nearly worked up to his death on December 26, 2006. However, he had 2 strokes at 90 and retired to his home in Rancho Mirage, California. Just remember, he was a Ford, not a Lincoln.